My name is Rachel Singleton Polster. I use she, her, and I live on Statlium lands in Canada. I am of European descent, and as a settler on stolen land, my Quaker faith calls me to work to address ongoing human rights violations endured by Indigenous peoples who have undergone colonization and oppression in Canada and globally. I work for the Canadian Friends Service Committee, CFSC, which is the social justice arm of Canadian Yearly Meeting, CYM. I am also currently the co-clerk of the Quaker United Nations Committee, New York. CFSC holds the mandate for FWCC on Indigenous issues globally, and we have worked in partnership with our Indigenous friends for over 25 years towards the adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Our reparations work includes building relationships and taking concrete action to address the ongoing impacts of colonization. Before going into the work that we do, we must first recognize who Indigenous peoples are. There are more than 476 million Indigenous peoples spread across 90 countries worldwide. Many other names are used, including tribes, First Nations, Aboriginals, ethnic groups, Adivasi, nomads, peasants, or hill people. In some places, the word Indigenous may have negative connotations, and it may not be safe for people to self-identify as such. Reflecting the global diversity of Indigenous peoples, there's no official definition of Indigenous. Instead, there's a modern understanding of this term based on the following 7 principles, which has been affirmed by the African Commission on Human and Peoples' Rights. First, self-identification as Indigenous peoples, individually and collectively by the community. Historical continuity with pre-colonial or pre-settler societies, strong links to territories, distinct social, economic, or political systems, distinct language, culture, and beliefs. Indigenous peoples form non-dominant groups of society and have a resolve to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments and systems. With that understanding, I'll pass it to Elaine.
My name is Elaine Bishop. I am a member of Winnipeg Monthly Meeting of Canadian Yearly Meeting. I am a newcomer to Canada, born in England with no ancestors buried in the soil of Turtle Island, an Indigenous name for the Americas. I came as a child when Canada really welcomed families like mine. White, mom and dad, 2 kids, English speaking. In school, I was taught a racist history of Canada and its genocidal relationships with the First Peoples of this land. Learning the true history, then discerning right ways forward through the lenses of Quaker testimonies to peace and integrity has been hard. I am speaking from Treaty 1, made and signed in 1871, which includes Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. I may live here with integrity because the Indigenous peoples here made treaty with Queen Victoria, agreeing to share the land, not surrender it, with incoming settlers. When I served as coordinator of CFSC, I chose Indigenous rights as a special area of concern. I later worked for 4 years for the Indigenous Lubicon Cree Nation in northern Alberta, Canada. There I experienced the resistance of Canadian governments and many Canadians to actually do justice, to be in right relationships with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous lawyer Amy Kraft describes treaty as relationship based on respect, reciprocity, and renewal. For me, this resonates with Ubuntu. Then how can I be a good non-Indigenous treaty partner trying to live Ubuntu? When I researched relationships between land and peace through the lens of Quaker peace testimony, I learned about Pay the Rent, a movement in Australia responding to its history of colonialism. Individuals and groups built relationship with the Aborigine nation on whose ancestral lands they lived and paid an annual rent to compensate that nation. I came back to Canada in 2004 with a vision of adopting this idea in Winnipeg. When I spoke about this, people got excited. Yet it was essential that Indigenous elders be consulted. At our first consultation, the elders who liked this idea said, "We don't have rent in our tradition." So we created an organization called Share the Gifts, Honor the Treaties. Share the Gifts, Honor the Treaties recognizes a variety of forms of reparations, including sweat equity with Indigenous-led activities, land return, and making material amends, including a reparations fund. I contribute 1% of my annual income to that fund. Money reparations enables me to return a proportion of the gifts that I receive from this land to those whose lives have been wounded by colonialism. This is not charity. It is part of being in right relationship, acknowledging the history of genocide and seeking to make this right. Ubuntu. I took this concern to Winnipeg Monthly Meeting, which now has minuted its commitment to direct 1% of its income annually to the Share the Gifts, Honor the Treaties Reparations Fund. We noted that 1% is very small, but it is a place to start. Now, with CFSC, we are taking this concern to CYM, Canadian Yearly Meeting. CYM has been learning and witnessing to Indigenous justice for over 50 years. In 2010, CYM affirmed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2013, it repudiated the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine initially propagated by Catholic popes in the late 1400s, which colonizing European nations used to justify their seizure of Indigenous land worldwide. In 2016, it minuted its recognition of the outcome of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which documented the history of Indigenous residential schools, institutions to which Indigenous children were stolen from their families and forced to attend to destroy links to their families, cultures, languages, and land. CYM only exists because Quakers in Canada live, work, and worship on lands that were and are Indigenous. To what more are we called by Ubuntu? Making money reparations may be a next step in seeking repentance and repair. Indigenous Murray Sinclair, lead commissioner of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, acknowledged that it has taken 7 generations for Canada to have such broken relationships with Indigenous peoples. He acknowledged that it would take 7 generations to make this right. We are that first generation. Ubuntu calls us to claim our part now, to do what is right now, so that the next 6 generations can build on this work. And now back to Rachel.
Thank you, Elaine. Now I'll share some examples and practical ways in which Quakers can engage with these concerns. One example of tangible reparations is that of Alaska Friends, who have given over $93,000 US to Indigenous peoples impacted by a Quaker Indian boarding school. Another is of California Friends, who have ethically transferred land at the site of the Sierra Friends Center to the Nisenan people. And yet another is of Friends leading work on research and reparations regarding Quakers' complicity in Indian boarding schools and the children who died while under the responsibility of Quakers in these institutions. All of these tangible acts of reparations started from taking initiative to learn and change ourselves and how we run our organizations. We can do this by first learning the history of Indigenous peoples where we live. As friends, we must remember that listening to other perspectives may challenge our beliefs and sense of belonging. I'm reminded of the advice, think it possible you may be mistaken. Secondly, we must take corporate action to reject systems of colonization and oppression. We encourage other yearly meetings to repudiate doctrines of discovery and to encourage other faith communities to follow. These doctrines persist in our legal systems, perpetuating discrimination and ongoing land theft. We fully reject these doctrines and encourage all meetings to learn how they impact the development of their state's legal systems. We use CYM's affirmation of the UN Declaration as an education tool in meetings, guiding work towards reconciliation. We encourage all yearly meetings to carry out this education and to commit to uplifting human rights. We have also developed a series of queries for reconciliation, urging friends to take individual and collective actions towards reconciliation and reparations. These meetings are all attached, and we encourage you to bring them home to your meetings as tangible actions we can take towards right relationships with Indigenous peoples. Thank you.